So, hi everyone, and welcome to this 15th Urban.AI conversation. My name is Hubert, and I'm the founder of Urban.AI. So, very quickly, what is Urban.AI? It's a think tank dedicated to the emerging field of urban artificial intelligence. Our very own specificity is that we are collaborating with a growing community of renowned and international experts, including Scott Shepard, with whom we are conducting research experiments and events. Urban.AI is also a space for exchange and debate, and this is why we regularly co-organize Urban.AI conversations like this one with our Urban.AI community, during which Urban.AI experts can share insights or just ideas regarding the field of urban artificial intelligence. And today's session will be moderated by Scott Shepard, and we'll also have the great pleasure to welcome Peter and George, but I will let Scott introduce themselves. So, Scott, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Hubert. Yes, welcome everyone, and I'll be your moderator today. My name is Scott Shepard, and I am the head of policy and government affairs with Drover.AI. And I represent Drover.AI as a member of Urban.AI. I've personally been a member of Urban.AI for the last 2 years, so I'm really excited to join forces with Hubert. I think this is my second or third Urban.AI conversation, but the first time I've actually moderated. So I think we have a really exciting topic today. Our topic is Micromobility Policy Matters, Leveraging Urban.AI to Achieve Better Outcomes. And I'm really pleased to welcome two expert guests in our panel discussion today on this topic. Our first guest is Jorge Coelho. Jorge is the Chief Information and Innovation Officer with the Câmara Municipal de Faro, so the Faro City Hall, the Faro City Government in Faro, Portugal. And then we also have Peter Griffiths, who's the Global Urban Futures Expert with BABLE Smart Cities in UK. So thank you, Jorge and Peter, for joining us. We're really excited to kick off this conversation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
So just so everyone in the audience kind of knows our format, we're going to follow along a bit of a similar format. If those of you who are followers or subscribers to my own podcast and webinar series, which is called the Cities First Podcast, where we basically have an intro, we have a series of questions, a little bit of back and forth conversation, and then we go through a series of Q&A and chat. And then we have essentially the experts present their views for the future, and then we kind of wrap up. So we have about 60 minutes here. So we'll get started on our series of questions. But before we get started, what I'd just like to talk about is kind of setting the stage for this topic in terms of what we're going to focus on are multiple themes. One is micromobility, two is technology and AI or urban AI, and the three is policy, public policy, and how these three come together in the current landscape of micromobility now in 2023. As what myself and the panelists have already been discussing is we're at an inflection point right now. We're at a really turning point in the industry and in the ecosystem. So with that, we'll get started. And then I'll ask my series of questions. We'll have about 8 minutes for each question. And then for the audience members, if you have any questions you'd like to ask either myself or the panelists, please add those to the chat, and I'll either try to weave those in during the discussion while we're answering our questions, or we'll save those to the end. But just be known that I'll try to get through as many questions from the audience as possible. I'll be monitoring those as the panelists are speaking. So with that, let's get this started here and kick it off. So the first question I have, and I think I'm going to ask this, I'm going to randomize this back and forth, but I'll start with Jorge. So Jorge, the first question, and then Peter, you'll have a chance to provide your perspective too. But the first question is, how have micromobility policies and legislation evolved over the past 4 years? Now, why I say 4 years is because that's basically when micromobility or e-scooters hit the scene here in Europe, in Portugal, and throughout the European continent. So let's say from 2019 onwards, how have policies and legislation changed from your perspective in the public sector?
Okay. Well, thank you for asking. But well, basically, in our case, and specifically Faro, we did start only in February 2019, so it really does cover this period. So these 4 years are full on. I'd say like not like focusing a bit beyond Faro, even just Portugal. E-scooters only hit the streets in 2018. So it was something that obviously started in the bigger cities. To be honest, actually, it started mostly in Lisbon, because in Porto they had a very strict approach to this new offering. Basically, in their case, they closed the doors. They didn't let no operator step in and run their show prior to understanding what the scope and getting regulations on out in public. So they took some time to actually see scooters touch ground. Obviously, Lisbon it's a bit all over the place what happened, and now Carlos Moedas is really taking some action and moving forward. But obviously, the operators, you had quite a few, over a dozen actually, were competing, and the operation certainly was going very bad in Lisbon. So they started looking for other cities, the district capitals, as also Faro. And they started to spread throughout Portugal in different cities. So basically, in regards to legislation, I wouldn't say there had been any move. The first move that you really have from central government, from even the regulator, the transportation regulator, they only took their position now in January this year. So they're actually going through the literature, looking what's happening in other cities. And then they really did advance with some interesting proposals. They set forth a package with 4 sets of proposals that cover from the concept itself, because like micromobility doesn't show up in the legislation as a possibility. There is a place where it can fit in, but it's not explicitly mentioned. So they fill that gap. And then they also go into the vehicle specifications. So we're talking about like what the importers need to keep in mind. And also finally, they step into the sharing legislation, shared transportation legislation. So basically they cover those set of policies, and actually going down to legislation itself. And the Transportation Authority, they're not the ones who are going to issue these changes to law. So they provided these suggestions and proposals, and then other entities that rule, or even the government itself, will move forward or not with these suggestions. So basically, obviously, there was this tone that underlines this set of proposals. They pretty much focus on safety, and that's positive when we're looking into the public space. But then they bring in an issue that might bring a wide array of problems. It's obligations in regards to helmet usage, and so they're not really explicit in their aim for compulsory use of helmets. But they do so below 16 years of age. So it's like a balanced strike, but it is something like that. In my understanding, it's a tricky path to go down, especially if we look at numbers of public bike usage in Australia and Canada. The impact versus the capital that public expenditure is putting into those offerings, it isn't really getting paid back, and it's mainly because of the helmet compulsory usage. So basically, yeah, I get in this case, what's happening now in Faro, to wrap up. We're like, over this period of 4 years, it was a period that we opened up for like a trial period. We were welcoming operators that were willing to step in. And with a very open conversation, sometimes telling them to keep numbers down, other times to get them a more balanced offering throughout the territory. But basically, over this period, we've got a better understanding of where can we go, put our demands. And also on the operator side, I guess they also get an understanding and a feel how can they strike a balance also this sustainability of the operation. So I guess now also the council that has this issue in hands, she's determined to move forward in having regulations. So that currently the municipality is working on that. So by the end of this year, we will most probably have those regulations, and there will be a tender for operators to step in and really have their permits issued. So basically get a step beyond the trial period that started in February 2019.
Wow, what a great microcosm Faro, Portugal, and the south of Portugal is to the entire European micromobility ecosystem. Peter, hang tight. I'm going to ask you the same question, but just to summarize what George said, we can see that full progression or that full chronology from pilot phase to regulation, national guidance to now actual tendering. And we're seeing this across so many markets continent-wide in Europe. So I really appreciate that perspective, George, because I think that this is kind of a common theme that we're seeing in the maturity, quite honestly, from the public sector in terms of embracing micromobility along a legislative and policy path. So yeah, thanks, George. So Peter, let's hear from your perspective on the operator and the private sector side of the same question.
Yeah, no, I'm glad George went first, but now my challenge is finding something different to say. But I'd say that the first thing is
improvised.
Yeah, but I think 5 years ago, the only place I saw e-scooter parking was at my kid's school. You know, so actually there's something fairly dramatic in that. Yeah, but I would say in some ways that the biggest shift is that in the last 4 or 5 years, dockless and powered shared micromobility has become much more widespread. And so cities have had to think about how they manage these vehicles, particularly parking and speed, but also whether they should be regulated as private vehicles where people maybe need a license, or more like public transport where the barrier to entry is kept to a minimum. And in many ways, across helmets, across age restrictions, across speed restrictions, in some ways the tension is at play. Is it a private vehicle? Is it a public vehicle? Should the barrier to entry be high? Should it be low? Something else which I would say has changed is partly political, is that the incentives for cities to provide cycle infrastructure has also grown on the back of an increased legal requirement for net zero. And I'd say also because some city leaders have realized champion bicycles sometimes wins elections. So there's something interesting happening there. But I would say that, you know, if we look at kind of the $5 billion shared micromobility project, you know, and political shifts, they're not necessarily aligned. But what we've also seen is that cities are taking much greater leadership, exactly what George said. After a period where vendors were much more able to set their agenda. And I'd say having the impulse to try something new from the private sector is good for illustrating the potential around the future of mobility. However, mobility is a service that often works best when it is driven by the public sector, and we're seeing that more and more as we go into a phase where we may talk more about shared mobility as a transport provider rather than a transport operator. And something interesting is whether, you know, these market and policy shifts might shrink the micromobility business model too. Something interesting, you know, from policy point of view.
Yeah, policy point of view, how it affects business and commercial models, and what is this balance between, let's say, the subsidization, as well as who are the main patrons of micromobility? Because again, we're seeing a consistent track, like you had mentioned, in the other parallel ecosystem of mass mobility as a service, and both are kind of trending more, at least somewhat, to the public sector, or public sector's taking more of a, like I like to say, it's more of an activist role. They're coming to the table and taking a, let's say, a much more active role than they were 4 years ago, which was more hands-off, or shall we say, laissez-faire, just kind of let the market play out. Well, we kind of see how that's shaped up. So we're, you know, trying a different approach now. But anyway, with that, let's get on to the next question here, which is, and Peter, I'll let you take this one first. And this is kind of similarly related, which is, what is the spectrum of markets from open to closed that micromobility providers on the private sector can operate in? And, you know, what are these different flavors of markets, and perhaps how are these markets shifting given these operational constraints from a commercial perspective, a policy perspective, as well as from a user perspective?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, Scott. But I also think we need to be careful about how we use open and closed. Because I would say that possibly as many as 1 in 2 markets are open in the sense that cities haven't actively regulated shared micromobility. But this might be good for short-term profitability, but not necessarily provides any certainty long-term. And I'd say we've seen over time that markets will follow the trend towards greater regulation. And the sector is slowly gearing itself up for that. But I think what's interesting here is the change in market conditions. Is not that long ago, micromobility providers were keen for a mix of completely open or multi-tender environments, as this suited a growth agenda of being able to access as many markets or cities as quickly as possible. With a shift towards profit, tighter market conditions, I suspect that we'll find closed conditions are much more appealing. And actually smaller cities, which is exactly what George was saying, like exiting Lisbon, finding smaller cities, because these are less competitive and potentially less demanding too. But closed conditions are what give shared bike schemes very long agreements with cities, which is why so many shared micromobility companies are diversifying portfolios to include e-bikes and not just e-scooters. But there's a consequence to this though, and it'll be interesting to see how smooth the shift is while VC money still needs to be paid back. Because the more closed the market, the more like public transport these schemes need to behave like, and arguably perhaps the slimmer profits, more social value, and less disruptive brand positioning. So it's a very different business model in some ways from a marketing point of view. May also shift away from a more B2C type model of vendors trying to prove that they're different to providing a service that's much more guided along a broader public policy strategy. In this case, being a disruptor is perhaps slightly less relevant, which is also interesting in a subsidy-driven market, which suggests that the investor makeup may also shift to longer-term investors. And then I suppose maybe the last thing is that more integration into public transport may also open up the opportunity for shared resourcing, which means micromobility providers may see themselves much more integrated into a broader public transport offering in some cities, where market conditions are quite closed.
Wow, a lot of stuff. But yeah, just to kind of summarize, and I'll ask you the same question, George. But I would say greater certainty for the providers, perhaps smaller markets or smaller scale, smaller cities that provide a bit more consistency, less winner take all, a bit more of moving away from the zero-sum game of these open markets to markets that are a bit more balanced. And like you said, Peter, align with environmental, social, and economic policies on the part of cities and regions, and then inclusion in public transport and mass. So I think that and this is consistent with our last question, which is this maturity of the ecosystem, and certainly this leadership on the part of the public sector of guiding these private sector venture capital financed startups and operators into this more clearly demarcated box, or clearly demarcated, let's say, positioning, so that this is either the minimum cost of doing business, or this is basically where you can operate in and perhaps thrive in the long term. So this might, like you said, Peter, attract a whole different class and profile of VCs and investors into this new, let's say, business model and scheme. So then, George, the same question to you, which is, I'll just repeat this: what is the spectrum of markets from open to closed that micromobility providers can operate in? Your perspective coming from the public sector.
Yeah, well, yeah. Initially, what we saw was you'd have two positions. Basically, you'd have the cities that would be very cautious, so they wouldn't really. They'd have their meetings with the operators, but they wouldn't open the doors. You had the other ones that would open and would have some sort of conditions. This also happened in Lisbon. So basically, in the case of Faro, we mimicked, and we learned a bit from Lisbon. So we had the operators sign agreement with the city where they had to share information. They also had to follow our instructions. And basically, we didn't have a very tight rules, but we had a very clear communication. There was in this agreement. what I saw was there was actually in the beginning we had a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. We had actually a city, I won't call it out, but there was a city in Portugal that they wouldn't let any operator step in, but they ran their own operation. So they didn't understand nothing of the business. They got 30 scooters or whatever in the streets. Obviously, it was something that didn't take off. And what I see here is obviously we got this, we're in this position that we see this maturity growing along. But I think like we're heading something closer to mid-terrain. And I don't believe that this will be really what will be in the future of this offering. What I see is that the market tends to be sort of closed. There will be these contests for the operators to step in. But what I do see as a big advantage, to make a contrast with the city that had running their own scooters, is that if you've got these businesses that are stepping in, and they are stepping in with a business with a purpose for profit, they're no longer burning VC cash. So yeah, we're far beyond the point that we had those cases of OFO and Mobike. So it's we're seeing, what I do see is they will tend to be very ingenious in revenue streams. So we're not talking about this $1 or €1 to unlock and then whatever for each minute. What I see is there will be an opportunity, because even like our national authority for transportation, where they saw value for this transport for micromobility, is clearly in the first last mile of public transportation. So what I do see is like there is a promising space for these operators to unlock some new revenue streams. That something will be a bit like B2B. And what I see like that would be something that can add on to the sustainability, and also to make this transportation as a whole more streamlined. Because it's been something that's been tricky. We've seen a lot of talk going around mass. And what I do see is like this micromobility is unlocking the talks that were needed to really make mobility as a service a possibility, because we really need to have lots of people talking, lots of people setting agreements, and really fine-tuning even down to the technology. So this is something, and that's like where obviously like Peter's got a very keen say in a word in what we're talking about policy. But what I see from local government, it's very on the ground. So we're not like too abstract in these national policies. We're really trying to enact them and see how they can have impact on the ground. Obviously, like this will differ and will be, if it's the markets are open or closed, it also depends on, it will have an impact on people. So people really, and the customers and the users of even public transportation in its whole, including public transportation, they need to fit into the question, and also in the streamlining of the experience, being the ticketing, the pricing, all this. And so I guess the sweet spot will be somewhere in the middle between the open and the closed.
Okay, so we have a couple questions that have popped up. I think we can probably just maybe field these now, George and Peter, and then we'll just get on to our next, actual question here. So Karine has a question based upon what you said, George. So she says, hello, George has described the now usual way of development of micromobility. And I'll let you both guys answer this, but she says, do you think that the current Paris backlash we knew Paris was going to come up here. So let's talk about Paris right now. That is the elephant in the room. So what she says is, do you think that the current Paris backlash is specific to Paris, or that the same could happen everywhere? I have my own personal opinion, but I'm going to let you guys speak, and I'm going to give my opinion too. And she says, how do we prevent that? Contract, laws, etc. So Peter, what do you think?
Well, I think if something happens in one place, it can always happen in another place. So once you open up the door for something to happen somewhere, it can happen in other places. That said, not all cities will be able to have some kind of referendum mechanism. So there might be some legal limitations to following the same approach. I think the question here is much more, how do cities effectively balance the winners and losers when it comes to introducing a new service like shared micromobility? And I think that's maybe the tension point that's not being answered yet. When you think about other cities, could they go the same way? Well, I would look at how well the city's managing that. But with Paris, I guess my main feedback question to Paris is I'm not sure whether this is a good example of democracy, letting the people decide, or it's a really bad example of not trusting your own technical experts to actually put the strategy in place. And I think that's, I think that's quite, it's potentially quite disempowering. And I know this feeds a little bit into the next question about the maturing of the industry from a public sector point of view, but I actually think Paris, given the amount of public transport infrastructure that it has and its long history with the Paris Metro, should be able to make this decision from a technical point of view themselves.
They have the brain power. They should be able to figure it out, you would say. So yeah, but so George, what do you think about that question? What about Paris? And do we think that worst case scenario, all of the European continent is going to follow lockstep with Paris and micromobility is over? Basically, that's what we're wondering here. I'm being a little extreme, but everyone's very fearful.
I don't believe so, because specifically in Portugal, if our National Transportation Authority hadn't stepped in, and they're like the sector regulator, so they have a very strong word. If they've kept silent, I wouldn't be very comfortable answering. But they really did. They made their opinion public in January, and so they really do see this as a possibility to expand the potential of public transportation. So this is all over the place, be it North America, Europe, major investments being done in public transportation, and the impact isn't very clear. And there are some cases that it's quite. So what we see here is we need to embrace the widest set of options possible to really empower public transportation. And this is a possibility. So in what I see in the case of Paris, it's quite unfortunate. But what I do, and I'm not really being deep into the issue, but what I do see, it's more of a political thing. So maybe there is some need for the mayor to gain some voting power, and so getting the word on the street might help her in that sense. But it's not very. It seems very contrary to the maturity that they really do have in regards to public transportation and all, public space management and all. They really are in a very distinct position within the European context. So this is a very odd key to the chord. So it really doesn't make much sense, and I don't believe it will happen unless you do see same political conditions happening. But just to finalize, to end, in my opinion, I guess that if we're really going down the street into a more mature, more stable relations, the operators themselves, obviously they're looking into having longer term relations. So if there is a minor risk of having an operation closed down due to a referendum that that could go sideways, obviously the city could obviously close the operation, but they would most probably have to compensate for their losses. So I guess that's where if we really get into I don't believe that risk will be something that will take root in many places, but it will have a cost.
So I'm going to obviously add in my 2 cents on this is, Peter, you knew this is coming. So what's happening in Paris, it runs contradictory to its role as being the global 15-minute city. I'll tell you that much. One, Hubert, you can add to your thoughts on that. You're in Paris. You know what I mean by that. And it certainly runs counter to all its investment in cycleways and shared infrastructure during the COVID pandemic. And then not only that, in my conversations with multiple French cities just over the last month or so, it's simply illegal. So this comes to your point, Peter, to have a referendum such as this in other French municipalities. And even across Europe, many municipalities just say, we simply do not have the frameworks to do something similar to what Paris is going to be undertaking in April. So my 2 cents are, one, it kind of runs counter to this green mobility brand and this role that it's trying to position itself, one. And two, many cities simply aren't set up to, follow lockstep with what Paris is doing, whether you agree with what they are doing or not from a plebiscite or a referendum level. It's just the legal mechanisms are not there. So what George was saying in terms of this middle path or much more of a incremental step is really kind of my viewpoint of how the European marketplace is moving forward. So then next question, questions are popping up right now, guys. So we have a question from Antoine Verhulst. So hello, George and Peter. I'm not sure if I understand this question, but he says, are private actors pushing more and more for closed contracts? Do they include that in their business models? So Peter, I'm going to let you answer this first, if you can interpret what he means by closed contracts.
I'm guessing that maybe he means more tendering. And I would say not all shared micromobility operators were pushing for the same model, but there was
not one size fits all.
Not one size fits all, but there has definitely been a shift towards a multi-tender environment where you have a city that has spaces for 2 or 3 operators, and it's managed. And
versus wide open. Yeah, that's what he's saying. Now I understand. Yeah, so kind of like this would be the Madrid model. This is the Madrid tender that just dropped like 2 or 3 weeks ago, where the top 3 operators were qualified out of, I think there was 10 respondents. So it's that kind of ranked choice of tendering. And at least from what I'm hearing, a lot of operators are certainly not against it, but they are cognizant that that is the direction that cities are taking. So George, I think you already spoke from your perspective in Faro. You guys are going to go out to tender later this year, next year. Do you think that this is a trend that's starting to expand across Europe?
I believe so. And even from the talks that I've had taken place with the operators, that I believe that they have that expectation too. So what I'm guessing is that even they need to have a clear understanding. And maybe this might be like the aftershock of Paris. They might be looking for having a stable relation, and that they can foresee their operations over the 2 to 3 years, instead of being like in the risk of ending operations in the next month. So even from their end of the operators, and gathering from what they've been talking, it seems that they are really looking forward for the tenders.
Yeah.
Something that's probably worth just adding to the mix here is who benefits from that. And so very big operators or operators with a lot of local content would probably prefer closed tendering, whereas everybody in the middle probably prefers open tendering because it's their best shot of getting on streets. And so actually, depending on your position within the market, you're going to prefer open tendering or a more open approach, at least.
Right. Where are you at in the value chain? Hubert, thank you for your question. That's actually one of our questions I'm going to be asking Peter and George towards the end of the call here in terms of applications of AI in the micromobility. So we'll come back to your question, Hubert. Thank you. And then Andre Duarte has a comment. This is not a question, but he's adding for us. He says, if I can add, recently in Lisbon, we had a referendum to decide if part of a neighborhood would have car parking tariffs. The problem is that only residents were allowed to vote and not the users of public transport and micromobility. This sounds like Paris. Exactly the same thing. Mainly students and workers. So thank you, Andre. Yeah, that's what a lot of the operators in Paris are challenging, the legality and the user base of voters that are going to be captured in this referendum. So Andre, what you're saying about what's happened in this local referendum for car tariff parking in Lisbon is on a much broader scale in Paris for micromobility. So thanks for sharing that. Okay, so now we're going to get on to the next actual question for Peter and George. So George, I'm going to ask you this question. How is the public sector maturing and beginning to incorporate micromobility schemes into public policy and urban planning now? So now I'm hooking in urban planning into this maturity theme in the public sector. So any thoughts on that? I don't think we can't hear you, George.
Okay, sorry. Basically,
the question, right?
I did perfectly. Basically, what I'm seeing, like going from abstract to more concrete, like regulations are really taking root, and so we see Lisbon's already got a very advanced proposal. Porto has already got something going, and they actually got 2 operators that were selected through a tender. And so they really got within their code, the municipal code, they got a set of regulations. And this is becoming widespread, so it will become our case. But when you're talking about planning, what I do see is we're still a few steps behind. What is really happening, and this is more of like a coincidence, is that there is like increased pressure for cycling infrastructure to take place within the urban plans are being designed. So what I do see is like there will be an answer for micromobility, but it's obviously it's nothing specific for micromobility, because there are a set of specific issues that should be considered, and I don't believe they are still within the scope of attributes that are being taken to the table when we're doing urban planning. But obviously, like urban planning does happen over large cycles of time. So we're talking something like 20 years. And so I believe that will be something that will be taking place. Anyhow, in the midterm, when we go down to finer scale, the urban design, we do see some redesigns taking place. And there, you already see some solutions that are specific to micromobility popping up. One that I'm very keen on, and something I was learning from Lisbon in our case, was to actually steal car parking spots and relocate them for e-scooters. So, and now for public bikes. So that's a smart move. It's a quick action, and it's something that does deliver impact. And obviously, it's something that we did see in COVID really take root. So in regards to urban design, I see something, obviously, like you do see some things that are very like a tactical urbanism approach, very guerrilla sort of thing. But those are really changing from temporary to becoming permanent. And that's really delivering impact. That's something that it's been a major plus for micromobility in improving our urban environment. And so what I do see is like maybe from that practice, then maybe over the cycle of 20 years, will we see impact on our urban plans?
Wow, I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you, George. That I really liked your points around tactical urbanism and kind of do-it-yourself urbanism, and this transition from temporary to permanent in the urban design of cities during the COVID era. So thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. So Peter, maybe same question, but from an operator perspective, and maybe how are operators help partnering with cities for better urban planning and design in light of, let's say, the opportunities of micromobility, given this kind of change in landscape, if we want to layer in the concept of 15-minute cities and other interventions where micromobility can play a pivotal role?
Yeah, no, thank you, Scott. I think maybe just before I get there, it's worth flagging that these are two very different questions. In the one hand, that one is getting to grips with new ways of provisioning micromobility in cities, and the other is changing how cities work entirely. And these are two very different things. And I know that we've spoken briefly just about the maturity of Paris in terms of actually being able to do public transport, but I think it's also worth flagging that the cities and public sector is significantly more mature than the private sector is, in the sense that they've been running schemes with multiple vehicles over a much longer period. And so in some ways, actually, it's not so much maturity in terms of, it's much more maturity in that cities are getting to grips with how the micromobility business model works and how they can incorporate that much more strategically, which is, I think, quite a big shift, actually, that's happened quite quickly in a short space of time. But I think where there is scope for the private sector is that knowledge is uneven. And so there are a lot of smaller places where I suspect micromobility is going to go to, smaller cities, which will need much more market engagement and market consultation. So actually, what opportunity does that provide there? But I think it's also finding a way of moving away from being a pilot. That's a big part of the maturity cycle, to actually being integrated within other forms of mobility. And that could actually be a broader strategy that includes autonomous shuttles or other new forms of mobility that maybe are just coming to the fore, and not necessarily treating micromobility and a big treasure trove of new data as something separate, actually seeing it as just an enabler of a broader trend towards rethinking how we move in cities. But what I would say is that with urban planning, it's both quick and slow, in the sense that some cities in Europe have managed to roll out bike lanes very quickly in a short space of time. The guerrilla tactics around parking, we've got a lot more equity around vehicle parking, in a short space of time, where actually is a parking lot for a big car, or is it for a small bicycle or scooter? It's something interesting happening there. But I would say that in some ways where the opportunity is making journeys generally more accessible to people. So I don't think that we've gotten there yet. So if I consider, I used to do a 10-mile cycle to work every day, not everybody can do that. And so I think the opportunity is there for rethinking journeys entirely, and actually maybe shrinking down some of those journeys and using some data in terms of how people move around in cities as part of how do we retrofit mixed use? How do we rethink the composition of how city space works? How do we insert new activities within space that we haven't thought of before? So I would say, probably the biggest thing that they, almost, if you want to say this, massive pilot and billions of rides as gifted cities, is the ability to think differently about how people move, and actually some of the internal dynamics of how a city is put together. And
I apologize, that was a two-part question. So yes, Peter,
yeah.
but thank you. You answered that brilliantly. So that was good. and you really kind of covered the first part, which was around how cities are embracing their maturity of business models. Not to say they're not mature, they are, but their understanding of the business model. And then, as you mentioned, whether cities move fast or slow in the urban planning process, and basically leveraging these opportunities that micromobility lends to a more, let's say, refined, sustainable urban mobility landscape in the post-COVID city, where we saw these real emergency, quick, rapid interventions or implementations of tactical urbanism, or plans that were basically on the shelf for the last 75 years since the Second World War and gained zero traction. But COVID basically was the catalyst to get cities moving. So how do we kind of continue with that that momentum, which is really interesting here? Looks like we have some questions popping up again here. Let's have a look. So George, this is for you. So hi, George, this is from Chris Elliott. Related to the urban planning point, do you think we will ever experience an introduction of micromobility only lanes? Ooh, that's a good one. Akin to bike only lanes, or is that over engineering? E-bikes share bicycle lanes, but bicyclists here in the UK aren't always in support of sharing bike lanes with e-scooters or with e-bikes, e-scooters. And then he says there's a complex relationship between micromobility, bikes, and pedestrians that needs to be managed going forward. Yes. So George, why don't you take that? And then I want to get your perspective as well, Peter.
Well, my understanding is urban space is very precious resource. So it's very limited. And if we go down, chopping it down to each bit, to each special mode of transport, we weren't ending up having a very good experience. And so even to manage it would be total chaos. What I would see is how do we get these things to get more balanced? Maybe, and that's something I'm maybe a bit critical for the opinions that were made public by our public Authority for Transportation. They're aiming for a 20 km/h limit. And what I do see, it's something that should be more fine-tuned, because sometimes I believe that 20 km/h is too much. Obviously, they do state that. They do state that there should be spaces that there should be slow speeds. But what I do see is like even 20 km/h, it's quite a bit for the stability that this option offers. So what I would see is like maybe we should see among these different groupings of solutions, how can we like make them more harmonious in their relation among themselves? So I wouldn't like be creating special lanes for micromobility. I prefer to see them going slower maybe than to have a special lane for themselves. And saying that, I'd say that for docking solutions, I'd say that for a whole bunch of other needs that that are begging for a response from the public space. And we can't really go forking out specific solutions for all. So we will need to enforce some standards. We will need to enforce even operational standards for these different modes. Otherwise, it will be very, very difficult to manage this rare resource that we have. It's called public space.
Yeah, a precious space indeed. So, Peter, what are your thoughts on this question?
I think you've got to consider the culture of movement and also the need for movement in different places. And by that, what I mean is, so I spent some time in Slovenia a few years ago, and I was amazed that in the middle of the city, which is largely bike-free, people were just cycling and weaving in and out of the pedestrians, and it didn't cause any hysteria or discomfort, or didn't seem to. Whereas if you did exactly the same thing in the UK, the culture of mobility wouldn't necessarily work in the sense that people wouldn't feel comfortable walking with cyclists. And so there's probably something worth bearing in mind there, but there's also worth thinking about how far are people having to travel. So if I'm traveling short distances to get to where I need to get to, the incentive isn't there for me to go very fast. Whereas if I'm traveling very long distances, like in London, actually I need to move fast, because otherwise there's just no point taking a bicycle. And so that then creates more friction between cycling and pedestrian movement. And so that's something to think about. And I suppose the last thing that's worth thinking about is how do we live well together? And in some ways, if you take a purely technical or engineered solution and you split everything up, you never encourage people to figure out how to just get on with each other, which is one of the primary reasons we live in cities, is to be with other people. And so some of the tensions that exist between different modes of transport could probably be solved by forcing those different modes to interact more with each other, not necessarily less. I know that there are lots of safety questions that come from that, but sometimes interaction can be really helpful.
Yeah, so over-engineered, over-segregated, uses of public space might present more problems than solutions, and the cultural factors are really clear in terms of certain areas and regions are a little more comfortable in sharing spaces and modes versus others that are a bit more demarcated. So a lot of considerations, and there's certainly not a one size fits all. So I think that's a great point, but I think we're sort of kind of running out of time here. So we have time for one more formal question, and then we'll kind of wrap up here. But again, audience, if you still have questions, add those to the chat and we'll try to answer those as we go here. So we still encourage that. So Hubert, this is your question, but I'm going to ask George and Peter that. It's about urban AI. I promise we're going to ask it. Let's say, George, how can AI, artificial intelligence, play a role in improving compliance with micromobility policy and enforcement?
I guess that could play out in basically two different ways. One would be to help us in the enforcement of the rules that we might lay out, and also to guarantee that there's a compliance. So that's definitely something that we don't need, or we don't actually have the resources to have people going around the street and police to check if the the scooter is properly parked or if they're going on the wrong places. It's something that really should be, it's a key piece where AI fits in perfectly. The other, I would say, in regards to operations themselves. So if everyone really is pushing for these operations to be sustainable, obviously they'll need to have their operations managed because they really need to be agile, because there are very people are pushing very opposing requests onto them at the same time, and so to strike the best options at every given time, they would really need to. They don't have much space for guessing. So I guess artificial intelligence will play a key role in also the operations. I'd add in looking at this in a like long-term scope. I like doing that exercise, and I see like AI within the urban domain at large. It's something that's like it's all over the literature. Much is spoken. Also see some solutions being offered, but truth is, it doesn't really get to touch ground. And what I see with micromobility will be maybe the first place where it will become quite apparent the potential that AI does hold for getting this harmonious city that Peter was speaking, that people can get like go comfortable with each other and start focusing more on what they have in common and less what is opposing between them. So like where we got tensions, we can have AI help us out easing that. But so I see like micromobility does have a really key potential in making apparent the potential of AI in future city management.
Very good. So all the way from enforcement and regulation to operations and better city management capabilities. So really, really good perspective, George. So Peter, what are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I think, Scott, in the benefit of time, I'm going to give you a summary of 3 quick points. So I think the one is AI can help unlock data-driven decisions. And by that, I mean, at the moment, operators aren't really incentivized to use their data to sanction better driver behavior, because in a sense, it's a kind of a penalty on use. And so opportunity for AI is to make sure that penalties are shared much more evenly and communicated more evenly across different modes, so that in a sense, what might be seen as the unfair regulation of e-scooters because they happen to have more tech on board is something which doesn't stop making roads safer. So I think there's something really interesting there just about unlocking data in a much more fair and even way, if that was possible. I think that the second is that by adding a whole lot of e-bikes and e-scooters to cities, we've kind of shrunk the average size of the vehicle, but we haven't shrunk the number of vehicles operating in cities to move around. Actually, we've added. And so I think one of the big opportunities with AI is to use all the vehicles across a city, so including buses and cars and e-bikes, to reduce the number of vehicles that we need to move people around a city. Because ultimately that would shrink mobility too, not just the vehicle size, but also the number of vehicles. I would say fewer vehicles would also improve compliance and regulation. But I'd say the big opportunity there is, mobility innovation won't end with shared e-scooters and e-bikes. And the long-term risk is that like cars, they also take up space, which could then be used for other forms of mobility innovation. So actually AI maybe deals with that. And I'd say, finally, maybe AI can deliver what mass hasn't fully been able to achieve yet, in that perfectly matching available services to my specific needs, day and night, different seasons. But I think something very interesting is the idea of increasing the meaning. And by that, I mean, if you think about journey planning, it's all point to point, but there's no sense of what those points mean. And something really interesting is AI could potentially unlock the opportunity for shorter journeys by suggesting a different end point based on what it knows I need, or possibly making the journey evaporate completely. And so I think there's something quite interesting about using AI, not just to shrink the number of vehicles needed in a city to move people around, but also to shrink the length of journey and maybe remove some journeys entirely. So definitely some interesting applications from AI that we've not seen in terms of how we can make places better for people living in them.
Yeah, behavioral nudges, definitely. That's another opportunity too with AI. Okay, so I think we've sort of run out of time here, Hubert. But before we do, and I'll hand it back to you, Hubert, in 1 second. So George, maybe you can tell us where the audience can find you on social media and other channels.
Yeah, I'm most active on LinkedIn. So yeah, basically it's linkedin.com/Jorge, Jorge Anyhow, the links will be on the show, I suppose.
And you, Peter?
And LinkedIn is also best for me. You can search for Peter Griffiths. And if you're looking for my handle, it's Peter Griffiths with a 0 at the end of it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, George and Peter. As always, a real pleasure. We're really honored to have you both here today. It was a great conversation. And thanks to the audience for your questions. And we're really excited to kind of complete this roundtable. Hopefully, we'll have a part 2 maybe somewhere down the road in the next few months. But obviously, Hubert, we'll kind of hand it off to him. And want to thank Hubert and Urban.AI for having us today.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Scott, Peter, George, for this fascinating, enlightening, and really amazing conversation on micromobility. The recording will be available very soon, maybe tomorrow or in the coming days on our YouTube channel. The link is in the chat. And we will actually have another Urban.AI conversation in the coming weeks. We do not have the date yet, but it will be very soon about generative AI and urban design. So this is also why I was asking this question in the chat. And yes, hopefully it will be a great pleasure to have a part 2 of this discussion. Thanks a lot, Scott, Peter, and George, and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.